Hi, this is Gail DeLuca of White Fox Beads, and today I'm going to be showing you how to do the brick stitched ends to this gorgeous multi-strand necklace using Czech glass beads. This project is a companion to the book that Ann Dilker and I have written called Czech Glass Inspirations. In the video today, we are going to also show you, instead of making the necklace version, we're going to show you how to do the bracelet version of this. And I'm going to walk you through how to measure it so that bracelet fits nice. I'm going to set that aside, and we're going to start our brick stitch using these size 6 seed beads, round rocaille seed beads. These are Japanese seed beads. We're going to be using size 11 seed beads. So let's get started. I've got some 10-pound smoke colored fire line because the beads I'm working with are a little bit on the darker side. And I want the 10-pound, that's a thicker size, because we want plenty of strength, and we're using big beads, so we don't have to worry about hole size when we're using the thick thread here. So I'm going to start by picking up 4 size 6 seed beads, and I'm going to just make kind of a circle with these and stitch through the first 2, coming around and pulling gently so that I don't pull my thread completely out, and creating 2 stacks so that they sit side by side. I'm going to repeat that thread path to give this a little bit of extra structure and let it make it easier for us to see what we're doing. So I'm going to stitch down through 2 beads and then up through 2 more, and then I'm going to take 1 more stitch to stitch down this way so that I'm working on the end away from the tail, which is back on this end. And I'm going to take a moment to move these pliers out of my way because my thread keeps getting hung up on those. We're going to do those steps a little bit later. Alright, so we're going to pick up 2 more beads. My thread's coming out this bead, so that means I'm going to stitch into this bead coming toward me, and just capture those 2 beads on the edge. Now I'm going to take 1 stitch without adding beads and go up through the 2 on the edge. We're going to do that again. Thread's coming out this time. Every stitch you take, it's going to flip back and forth, so you got to keep an eye. Just look where your thread's coming out, stitch through the opposite. And without picking up beads, just reposition the needle so it's coming out the end 2 beads. Now we need to do 1 more set of these, and then we'll be ready for our next step. And capture and stitch. Okay, so this is a basic ladder stitch. Some people call it a square stitch as you add more rows. For now, though, I'm going to set it aside because can you see how this is kind of loose and wants to flop around? When we wear our necklace or our bracelet with such big beads in such area, we don't want this to curl around. We want this to be nice and stable with some structure. So what we're going to do is right in here you can see a little bit of wire. I'm going to flip it around, and that's the other side. We are going to make our own wire finding, our own wire spacer, to perfectly fit these beads that you're using. And you can do this for just about any project. Once you know how to do this, you can adjust the size of the wire and the spacing of the loops to do exactly what you want to do. So for that, this is a bigger bead project. I want a nice hefty gauge wire. So this is a 20 gauge wire, and it's got a nice antique copper finish. And I'm going to use these flush cutters to cut it, but I've already got a piece cut off. And we're going to shape it with these round nose pliers. So here's the piece that I have trimmed already, and I'm just going to start by about 1/4 inch in. I want to make a loop with my plier. Okay, now I want to take that loop and hold it next to one of the beads that I'm working with, and I want it to be about the same size of the bead, so I want it to kind of blend in and melt in so that you really don't, so it doesn't stand out. Okay, so now that I've made one loop, I'm going to take my round nose pliers and hold it next to the loop that I've already made. I'm going to try and hold it, move this in different directions so you can see what I'm doing. And then I'm going to take the wire and wrap it around the plier again. There we go. Again, holding things so for the camera and holding things so I can see what I'm doing are difficult. But there's a second loop. Okay. So now I'm going to move the plier so it's next to that loop. Bring this around. Move my plier out of the way there. Okay, so now I've got 3 loops. I'm having a hard time seeing this. So this loop looks a little bit smaller, so I'm just going to kind of open it up, adjust it a little bit. There we go. Okay, so now we've got 3 loops. We need to do this so that we have 5 loops, which is how many beads we have. Just adjust my pliers. There we go. That's how many beads we have in our base, which is here. So I've got one more loop to go. So right here, make another loop, get the pliers out of my way. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now I'm going to trim it. I'm going to trim it right here for now because I might need to open those up a little bit more. So if I hold it next to my beads, it looks a little bit smaller. Looks a little bit smaller than what I need. So this is what's cool about making your own findings, is I can just start to open these up a little bit, stretch this out a little bit, and just kind of wiggle it until I get that so that it matches up nicely with my bead holes. Okay, I hope you can see that. I think that looks pretty good for what we want to do. And now I'm going to trim off that final piece. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to continue stitching with our ladder stitch, but now we're going to incorporate this finding in between the row that's already there and the next row that we have. So I'm going to take a stitch through the first hole and try and hold on to that. Now I'm going to pick up 2 size 6 beads, stitch through the finding hole next to it, and then the other 2 size 6 beads next to that, and let those separate so that you've got 2 beads. And then I'm going to come next door. Your thread's coming out here. You just come next door this way and stitch up through the 2 beads and the finding. I want to catch the finding in there with every stitch. Pick up a size 6 seed bead, let that fall down, and then stitch into this one next door so that I lock these 2 beads in next to each other, just like so. Okay, your thread's coming out here. I'm going to go to the next bead in the column, stitch through the finding all the way to the top edge where we're working, and that coming out that size 6. I pick another size 6, stitch through the finding, through the 2 size 6s, and down. Now I'm coming out over here. I'm going to step over to this next size 6, up through the next size 6, through the finding, pick up a size 6, let that fall down into place. Let's see if I can get this in the frame better. Now I'm going to lock it in by stitching through the one next to it. Okay. And now you can see that, remember how I could bend that and curl it very easily? This has got structure now. If I bend it, I'm bending the wire, and that's kind of hard to do because we've got a nice thick gauge. So that gives us some nice structure. So it's not going to take long. I'm going to walk us through adding another row, because sometimes it takes folks a while to get the hang of this stitch, because it's a little circular in nature. It's a little bit intuitive in nature. I'm going to try and hold it again better where you can see it. So for this first stitch from the end of the row, I'm going to pick up 2 beads and stitch through the bead next to it, down through the finding, all the way down. And I'm going all the way down here just because this is such a small piece, and the bead holes are big. I've got lots of room for thread. All of this is adding stabilization to the entire piece. If I were making one that was multiple inches long, I would not always stitch all the way to the bottom in the start. Okay, so now I'm picking up a 6, stitching through the one next to it to lock it in, down through the finding, all the way down. And then up through all the beads next to it, come out the top. 2 more beads in this row. Here's 1, stitch through next to it, all the way down, making sure to pass through the finding. From the bottom, stitch all the way up. Add a 6, stitch through the bead next to it, stitch all the way down. Let that 6 fall right in place there. And then stitch from the bottom. Now here, that finding might be a little close to the edge, and I'm gonna take that in a couple stitches just to make sure that I come up through that finding. Okay. So now we have got a nice stable base to start our brick stitch. We're going to be doing very little brick stitch. So if you've never done brick stitch before, this might be a good introduction for you. To start a row of brick stitch, we're going to pick up 2 size 6 beads. Now, if you can see the threads that go in between the beads, what we're going to do is we're going to stitch underneath the thread and then back up through a bead. So when we start a row for this triangle shape or pyramid shape pattern that we're going to do, we're going to pick up 2 beads to start the row. Then we're going to count the first loop in between 2 beads, the second loop in between 2 beads. The second one is the one that we want to catch. So I'm bringing my needle toward me, letting those 2 beads fall into place, and then stitching up through that second size 6 seed bead. And that locks those 2 beads into place. Now, whenever I start a row like this one on the end always tends to kind of stick up and flip a little bit. I can push them into place, but they're not going to stay that way. What I can do is I can take a stitch and come down through that bead and another bead. Actually, I'm going to back this out. Sorry. We're just going to go down through the one bead and then up through the bead next to it. And that will help get those guys to stay nice and straight. Now they're nice and straight. This guy's not all wonky here hanging out in the end. So that's our first 2 beads in the row. The next bead in the row is, you look for the next loop in between the beads in the previous row. You pick up your seed bead, come toward you with the needle under that thread, and then catch that bead by stitching up through it. When you stitch up through it, you have to be careful not to stitch back through that loop. Okay, the next and last bead in this row, pick up your 6, come under that thread and toward me, and then back up through that bead. And that's a nice, neat row of brick stitch added to these others. What this does for us is now we're going to gradually taper toward a pointed end, and you can't do that with this stitch. So these beads are sitting in between the previous row. So now we're going to do the next row. This row, we started out with 5 beads per row. This row had 4. For the next row, it's going to have 3. So I'm going to flip this over. We're starting the row with 2 beads. I count the first thread in between beads. I want to go through the second thread in between beads. Come toward me. Let those sit there and go up through that second bead. Okay, now this guy's sitting wonky, so we want to lock him into place. So I'm going to go down through just that bead and up through the one next to it. And now snug my thread, and that straightens it out and locks it into place. So that's 2 beads already. We've only, whoops, we've only got 1 more bead left in this row, and we're almost done. Now I'm going to stitch under the thread in between the beads and up through this end bead that I just added. Pull that snug. That's it for that row. So now you can see that we're starting to get that nice taper. Guys, we've only got 1 more row to go. Hang in there with me. It's the beginning of the row. We're going to pick up 2 beads. This is all the beads for this row. So I'm going to skip this first thread in between the beads, go over to the second thread in between the beads, come under it, stitch up through the second bead, snug it. Now I want to lock this edge bead into place and make them sit straight, so I'm going to stitch down through him and back up through the one next to it, and there we have a nice beautiful brick stitch end. So we are not done here. We need to stitch a loop of size 11 seed beads to catch the other end of our clasp. So I've got one end complete. So we've got a loop of size 11 seed beads going around a closed ring. This doesn't have an opening, it's not a jump ring, so I need to pick up my beads and stitch through this. Then we've attached this to a jump ring which attaches our clasp, and in this case I'm using a magnetic clasp, and then the mirror on the other side. So I'm just going to take this apart, set this all aside, and now I can just hold on to this and stitch with this part. So we'll show you this part. I'm going to pick up 9 size 11 seed beads. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We're stitching through the closed ring. And we're coming out 1 bead. We just want to stitch down through the other bead. And create a loop. Now on any piece of stitched jewelry especially, your wear point is going to be anything that involves your clasp and closure, because that gets pulled on, tugged on, put on and off every day. So I never leave it with just 1 piece of thread. Even though this is our 10-pound fire line, which is nice and strong, my recommendation is a minimum of 3 passes, more if you've got the room to do it inside your bead holes. So we're just going to take, and I can't do this all in 1 pass, we're just going to follow that thread path through all of our size 11s. And once you've got the findings in place, it may be a little harder to do it as in 1 pass, but we're going to just take a few stitches and try not to catch your thread around your clasp. There you go. Okay. That's 2 passes. And this will make a 3rd pass. Now it's getting a little harder to get my thread through, my needle and thread through there. And there you have it.
Okay, this is brick stitch part 2.
Okay, so we're back after a brief pause, and we finished the second end, and it's looking very nice. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to put this together into a bracelet. I have over here another end that's completed, and I'm just going to snap these back together. So now we're going to figure out how many beads do we need to string to connect the two ends into a bracelet. So now we're going to do some math. We are going to measure the length of the finding. So I'm going to measure from the edge of this ring to this ring, and what I come up with is 1 1/8 inches. Okay, now I measure one of my link ends with the brick stitch, and that also just happens to measure about 1 1/8 inch. So we have two of these, so that's 2 times 1 1/8 plus another 1 1/8, and that adds up to 3 3/8. Then you have to decide what is the length of the bracelet that you want. For me, I want to make my bracelet 7 3/8. That's just a hair smaller than 7.5 inch, which is the perfect size for me. If you want to know what length you need, I suggest taking a favorite bracelet that you love to wear and measuring it, fitting it on your wrist, and then measuring that to get your final length. So if I subtract 3 3/8 from 7 3/8, I get 4 inches. So that tells me that each of these sections of strung beads needs to be 4 inches long. So you want to snug it up, make sure there's no slack to make sure that you get an accurate measurement. I lay this on my ruler and I have 4 inches. If you make the bracelet a little bit too short, you still have a little bit of room to adjust with your finding. You could use a bigger finding, you can add a jump ring or two. Adding 2 jump rings it could add up to 1/2 inch. So you've got a lot of room for adjustment there. So then I'm going to take these apart again. What you do is get the ruler out of our way, and I've got my length of beads strung. Then I'm going to take it and stitch it to the other side of the clasp. And I'm going to stitch through, trying not to catch my other threads in here. Stitch through, pull that, and then up. I want to get this nice and secure. And then if my thread is coming out here to turn and travel, so my thread is coming out here, I just stitch into the bead next to it. Try not to get my thread hung up. There we go. And watch that thread disappear right in between those two beads. Hides it very nicely. Now I'm going to stitch all the way through. Well, maybe not all in one stitch. I might have to take a couple of stitches to get this done. There we go. Now I can stitch straight through, going through every bead. Always trying to make sure to go through that finding when you stitch. And there we go. So now you need to pick up another length of 4 inches of your Czech glass seed beads. I don't think I need to demonstrate the rest of this for you. You get the idea. And just finish adding your strands of beads and you will finish your bracelet. And here again as a reminder is what the finished necklace looks like. And that's it. This is Gail DeLuca at White Fox Beads. Thank you for watching.